Stop right there. Military vehicles are not allowed in this community.
It wasn't the sound of gunfire, the rumble of armored vehicles, or even the barking of Uncle Ricky's half-civilized golden retriever that kicked this whole mess off. No, it was a chicken sandwich. A spicy one, extra pickles, dropped squarely into Ricky's lap at the exact moment a woman named Karen Delacroix, armed with a novelty badge and delusions of law enforcement, blocked the entrance to Chestnut Ridge Estates with her electric golf cart named Justice. It was 8:42 a.m., and Ricky, unaware that he was about to be at the center of a federal-level suburban disaster, wiped sauce from his beard and muttered, "This is gonna be one of those days." Uncle Ricky had always been the type to draw trouble, like flies to a backyard barbecue. A retired Navy Seabee with more bark than diplomacy, he traded uniformed service for landscaping contracts and a truck so unnecessarily big it probably had its own zip code. The truck was wrapped in camo, had American flags painted on both doors, and blasted Lynyrd Skynyrd whenever he hit reverse. Chestnut Ridge had never been ready for him. But HOA rules be damned, Ricky had a contract, government orders, and 3 tons of mulch in the back. What he didn't have, apparently, was Karen's approval. She stood squarely in his way, blocking the narrow brick-paved entrance like a suburban Gandalf. Aviator sunglasses. Clipboard. A badge that read, "Neighborhood Patrol Official," complete with a sticker peeling at the edge. Her golf cart had flashing orange lights on top and a bumper sticker that said, "My other ride is the Constitution." She tapped the clipboard with a sense of authority usually reserved for federal judges and high school vice principals. "You can't enter this neighborhood without a permit," Karen said with the deadly calm of someone who alphabetizes her spice rack and logs every trash bin left out past 7 a.m. Ricky leaned out of his window, chicken sandwich in one hand, coffee in the other. "Karen, we've been over this. I'm delivering mulch to lot 17. Signed paperwork. Government contract. It's even got a fancy stamp and everything." Karen clicked her pen with surgical precision. "Chestnut Ridge has its own protocols. Our mulch policy clearly states that all landscaping deliveries must be cleared by the board and scheduled through." "You know I don't speak HOA," Ricky interrupted, mouth full. "I speak common sense and horsepower." That's when I pulled up behind him, watching it all unfold from my mom's ancient Camry, sipping an iced coffee like I was front row at a comedy show. I could already tell where this was going, and it wasn't ending with mulch being unloaded. Toby, Ricky's golden retriever and emotional support chaos machine, leapt up in the passenger seat and barked at Karen with all the unfiltered energy of a toddler on soda. Karen flinched, then drew herself up even taller. "I'm going to have to issue you a citation," she said coldly. Ricky raised an eyebrow. "Is that printed on glitter paper? Did you make that on Canva?" "It's legally binding, within the neighborhood," Karen sniffed. "Oh, good," he said, folding the paper into a paper airplane and launching it at her feet. "Then I'll see you in neighborhood court." Karen gasped like he'd kicked a garden gnome. That's when the rumble started. Not thunder. Not an earthquake. But the sound of heavy tires, diesel engines, and synchronized discipline. A military convoy, 6 Humvees, 2 armored personnel carriers, and 1 command truck, pulled up behind us like the world's most punctual parade. The air shifted. Everything suddenly got very, very quiet. The lead Humvee's door swung open, and out stepped a tall, square-jawed man in a crisp uniform. Colonel Baines didn't smile. Ever. He looked like a man who shaved with a bayonet and considered emotions a tactical vulnerability. He took one look at Karen's golf cart blockade and said, "What in God's name is this?" Karen turned toward him, undeterred. "Sir, this is a private neighborhood, and I am enforcing community regulations." Baines blinked once slowly. "Ma'am, I'm escorting a government contract vehicle. You're obstructing a federally authorized operation." Karen adjusted her sunglasses. "Well, I'm authorized by the Chestnut Ridge HOA to ensure all landscaping complies with our environmental aesthetics policy. That truck is in violation of Rule 12.3b, vehicular disruption of community aesthetic harmony." Ricky leaned out of the truck again. Translation: she doesn't like my bumper stickers. Colonel Baines walked forward slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Ma'am, step aside, or I will be forced to report this obstruction to federal authorities. That includes impersonation of law enforcement. Karen actually laughed. Impersonation? I am the elected president of this neighborhood. Baines gave a tight nod. Then perhaps your board would like to explain to the Department of Defense why a convoy carrying sensitive equipment was delayed by a woman in a golf cart wearing a plastic badge. Karen's mouth opened. Then closed. Then opened again. She looked like someone trying to reboot their brain after pouring water on the keyboard. Toby barked again. Ricky rolled down his window a little further. Hey, Colonel, want a chicken sandwich while we wait? Before Baines could answer, a man emerged from the second Humvee holding a clipboard and a file folder. Sergeant Mills, mid-40s, thick Georgia accent, and the perpetual air of a man who had seen too much and laughed anyway, gave Karen a long, thoughtful look. This the lady? He asked the colonel. Baines gave the smallest nod. Sergeant Mills smiled. Well, shoot, I thought she'd be taller. Karen was now frantically trying to call someone on her phone. You're going to regret this. I know people at the city council. This is an abuse of power. Baines looked at her, unimpressed. So is writing citations with cat stickers. Then, the real twist. The command truck's rear doors opened, and two uniformed men carefully stepped out carrying a box marked Simulation Equipment, Federal Use Only. Inside the box? Landscaping gear. Ricky's mulch delivery was a cover for a training drill. The entire HOA neighborhood had been designated a testing ground for how civilians might react to restricted operations. Karen had just turned that training scenario into a real-world problem. Ricky's truck wasn't just a landscaping vehicle. It was the focal point of a Department of Defense exercise, and now she was officially interfering. She didn't know it yet, but her entire neighborhood was about to go on lockdown, courtesy of her own fake badge and an unhealthy obsession with community guidelines. And that was all before Phyllis across the street opened her blinds, saw the convoy, and screamed, "They're invading!" Toby peed on her lawn. And we hadn't even unloaded the first bag of mulch. By the time the HOA called an emergency meeting under the community gazebo, the military convoy had rerouted itself into the cul-de-sac like an occupying force that preferred perfect hedges and freshly sealed driveways. The Humvees now sat idling on either side of the fountain Karen had personally fundraised for, and the sound of tactical boots on stamped concrete echoed across a neighborhood that hadn't seen this much excitement since the time the mailboxes were vandalized in 2019. Karen stood at the head of the gathering like she was about to brief a cabinet on national security, clipboard clutched so tight her knuckles were white, her hair still in a perfect bun despite the emotional meltdown brewing behind her sunglasses. Residents poured in with folding chairs and coffee mugs, most still in yoga pants or pajama bottoms. A few teenagers stood to the side recording everything on their phones, whispering commentary as if they were sportscasters. Ricky arrived fashionably late, not because he wanted to make an entrance, but because Toby had slipped his leash and decided to sprint 3 laps around the command vehicle before taking a very deliberate dump next to Karen's begonias. When Ricky finally sauntered into the gazebo area, he was holding a bag of popcorn and wearing a shirt that said, "License to mulch." Karen glared at him like he had personally cancelled her Wi-Fi. The HOA board, a mix of retirees and overcommitted stay-at-home parents, looked visibly overwhelmed. They hadn't expected their Tuesday to involve federal troops and social media chaos. Karen cleared her throat and started the meeting by dramatically slapping a fresh HOA manual onto the folding table. The slap echoed. Ricky clapped sarcastically. Colonel Baines, seated silently to the side with his arms folded, didn't blink once. As president of Chestnut Ridge HOA, Karen announced with full courtroom drama, "I am calling this emergency session to address a critical breach of neighborhood protocol and assess the threat posed by unauthorized military occupation on our streets." Ricky raised a hand. Question. If I set up a popcorn stand, do I need a vendor's permit or just your blessing? Karen ignored him. This community was built on order, cooperation, and aesthetic harmony. We cannot have rogue elements delivering landscaping material under suspicious circumstances. Ricky stood up. Suspicious? I've been your mulch guy for 4 years. You bought fertilizer from me last fall. That was before your truck had a bald eagle airbrushed onto the hood. She snapped. Colonel Baines finally spoke. For the record, this operation was pre-approved by federal authorities. Mr. Richards was subcontracted under a federal landscaping simulation program. Your so-called protocol is irrelevant. Karen blinked rapidly, then plastered on a smile. Then why wasn't the HOA informed? Why wasn't there a committee vote? Why? Because it's classified, Baines said flatly. Until you delayed us. Now it's a reportable incident. The room fell silent. Even the kids recording in the back had stopped whispering. Karen shuffled her papers in a dramatic, unnecessary way. Let's talk about the real issue, she said, regaining steam. The truck violates vehicle code height restrictions, and the dog has been off-leash multiple times in communal spaces. Ricky held up his popcorn. You're seriously trying to take down a federal training op with a leash law? Karen pulled out a printed citation and waved it triumphantly. Rule 8.2c. All deliveries over 2 cubic yards must be pre-approved and escorted by a licensed landscaping supervisor. This was not done. Therefore, I am within my rights to impose HOA sanctions, including but not limited to fines, service revocation, and community probation. Colonel Baines stood up slowly. Ma'am, you're escalating a civilian complaint into obstruction of federal activity. Do you understand the gravity of that? Karen smiled like someone who had just dared the devil to dance. Do you understand the power of local governance? At that moment, Sergeant Mills stepped forward holding a small black device. Sorry to interrupt this little legislative rodeo, he said with a casual twang, but I'd like to submit Exhibit A to this court of HOA law. He pressed a button. A recording began to play. It was Karen's voice, unmistakable, crackling through hidden audio. I don't care if he's got Pentagon paperwork. I don't want that redneck and his circus mutt tearing up my neighborhood. The only thing he's good for is fertilizer. The gasp that rose from the gazebo crowd could have powered a wind turbine. Karen went pale. Phyllis from Lot 12 dropped her reusable coffee cup. Ricky choked on a popcorn kernel. Even Toby tilted his head. Karen tried to speak. That's taken out of context. Baines raised an eyebrow. That's a direct quote, recorded from one of the surveillance gnomes your HOA funds have been secretly purchasing from a third-party vendor in Wisconsin. Each gnome contains a wireless mic unsecured. A long silence followed. Then Phyllis, who everyone knew was the real power behind the HOA, stood up and said, Wait a minute. We've been using gnome money for surveillance? Karen turned red. For community safety. You bought 38 of them, Phyllis said, flipping through a folder she hadn't looked at in months. That's over $2,000 in ceramic spies. And no one voted on it. Now the residents were murmuring. Some angry, some amused. One of the teenagers whispered, This is better than reality TV. Karen was clearly losing control. She attempted one last power move. This is slander. And I will be contacting my attorney. Ricky leaned forward. Does your attorney have jurisdiction over top-secret mulch deliveries? Because mine comes with a tank battalion. Mills chuckled and tossed a dog treat at Toby. Technically we've seen worse, but never with this much lawn decor. Baines turned to the HOA board. I suggest you resolve this internally before formal complaints are filed. You're skirting the edge of legal interference. We'll be done with the exercise by tomorrow. If we're not, it'll be because we're redacting your bylaws in a Pentagon office. The military team began dispersing, calm and collected. Ricky tipped his hat and walked off with Toby, who was now chewing on the recording device like it was a bone. Karen remained frozen at the gazebo, gripping her clipboard like it was a life preserver in shark-infested waters. As the crowd started to thin, Phyllis turned to one of the newer residents and said, We're going to need a new election. The woman nodded solemnly. And maybe a refund on the gnomes. Karen's phone began to ring. It was the local news station she'd called earlier. She ignored it. Back at the command truck, Sergeant Mills handed Ricky a Chick-fil-A bag. Thanks for not losing your mind back there. Ricky took the sandwich and smiled. Oh, I did. I just channeled it into paperwork. And just like that, Karen Delacroix, once the uncontested queen of Chestnut Ridge, had become a cautionary tale. Her HOA fiefdom was cracking. Her secrets were out. And tomorrow, whether she liked it or not, Ricky would be unloading the rest of that mulch. With a convoy escort. And Toby riding shotgun. The morning after the gazebo incident, the neighborhood looked like it was recovering from a bizarre battle no one could quite explain. The military vehicles remained stationed at the far end of the cul-de-sac, quiet and still, like statues of authority meant to remind everyone that the government had, in fact, shown up in Chestnut Ridge. Word had spread fast. Faster than the garbage truck Karen once ticketed for parking too long. By 9 a.m., 3 neighborhood Facebook groups were on fire, and someone had already made a meme of Karen with the caption, "You shall not mulch." Ricky, naturally, was back in his truck like nothing had happened. He had a fresh load of mulch and Toby hanging out the window with his tongue flapping in the breeze. His mood? Untouched. His playlist? Aggressively classic rock. But the neighborhood was not ready to move on. Tensions were simmering just below the surface, especially after Phyllis had circulated a spreadsheet showing exactly how much HOA money had been used for decorative surveillance gnomes. Turns out, Karen had authorized purchases from a company called Garden Guardians Incorporated, which specialized in covert ceramic observation. Ricky snorted when he read that line. She turned us into a backyard episode of CSI. By midday, the war lines had been drawn. A group of residents who considered Karen a visionary martyr had put up "Support our HOA president" signs on their lawns. Others, far more vocal, had begun removing their garden gnomes entirely, stacking them in a growing pile on Karen's front lawn like tiny plastic protesters. Someone had even added a sign that read, "These gnomes do not consent to surveillance." It didn't help that Ricky had decided to host a mulch and mingle event in retaliation. Flyers went up overnight, inviting the whole neighborhood to Lot 17 for free snacks, dog-friendly activities, and what he called re-education on how not to govern like a tiny dictator. Karen was, predictably, livid. She showed up halfway through the event with a folder of C. Sanders' letters and a Bluetooth speaker blasting classical music to drown out Ricky's Lynyrd Skynyrd. It didn't work. Not even remotely. Especially when Toby urinated on her speaker mid-symphony. The tipping point came during what residents would later call the gnome trial. Karen, still clinging to whatever scraps of power she had left, had demanded a formal arbitration of HOA complaints. She declared it would take place that evening on the clubhouse patio and that all residents were welcome to attend. Ricky, of course, showed up early with Toby wearing a bow tie and a PowerPoint presentation labeled HOA, How Overreach Annoys. The trial began with Karen reading a long statement filled with bureaucratic fluff and words like protocol order and aesthetic consistency. She even tried to reframe the military incident as a misunderstanding caused by incomplete communication on all sides. Colonel Baines, who attended only because he thought it might be funny, sat in the back drinking a soda and nodding like he was at an improv show. Then Ricky took the floor. He didn't start with rules. He didn't start with mulch. He started with receipts. Literal receipts. Itemized lists of gnome purchases, gardening expenses, and a $280 charge for something called Executive HOA Emergency Fuel Storage, which turned out to be 5 jugs of gasoline kept in Karen's garage for her golf cart. Ricky had gone full detective mode, even pulling up GPS data that showed her making random late-night golf cart drives around the neighborhood, presumably to monitor threats. "I'm not saying she's building a suburban surveillance state," Ricky said, clicking through slides. "But if anyone here finds a gnome in their shower drain, I'd start asking questions." Karen looked ready to combust. Then Phyllis stood up, holding what looked like a dusty old binder. "I was going through the original HOA records," she said calmly, "and I found this." She opened it. Inside were the original charter rules of Chestnut Ridge, signed by the founding board nearly 20 years ago. Turns out, the HOA president isn't allowed to spend over $500 on discretionary items without a vote. Karen spent over $3,000 this year. Mostly on gnomes and a personal foot spa. Ricky blinked. "So that's where my neighborhood fees went," Karen stammered. "This is a smear campaign. You're twisting my intentions. You spent $86 on glitter vinyl decals," someone shouted from the crowd. Karen spun around. "Those were for emergency signage." "They said gnome, sweet gnome," the same voice replied. As the clubhouse patio descended into chaotic laughter and shouting, Colonel Baines turned to Sergeant Mills and whispered, "This is more entertaining than the time we ran training in that Florida retirement community. I still think that lady was trying to poison us with banana bread," Mills replied. In the final act of the trial, Ricky brought out the piece de resistance, one of the gnomes, wired to play back audio. He tapped a button and once again, Karen's voice filled the air. "I don't care what the bylaws say. As long as I'm president, we do things my way." The silence was painful. Karen tried to respond, but her words crumbled under the weight of every bad decision made in the past 6 months. By the end of the night, Phyllis had motioned for an immediate vote of no confidence. It passed in record time. Karen received only 2 votes, hers and Ron's, who admitted afterward he thought they were voting on whether or not there'd be cookies. Karen walked off the patio like a dethroned monarch, still clutching her clipboard, muttering something about suing everyone and starting her own HOA. Ricky, ever the showman, stood and saluted as she left. The next morning, the gnomes were gone from every yard. Someone had wheeled them to Karen's porch with a post-it that said, "The people have spoken." In her place, Phyllis was appointed interim president. Her first order of business? Rewriting the bylaws to ban any form of neighborhood surveillance, banning the use of novelty badges as authoritative tools, and scheduling a weekly coffee and donuts social to lower community blood pressure. Later that day, Colonel Baines approached Ricky with a smirk. "Well," he said, "you managed to spark a mutiny without firing a single shot." "I just brought the mulch," Ricky replied. "And the dog," Mills added. Toby barked once, affirmatively. Karen's house was dark the rest of the week. Rumors swirled. She was packing up, selling, joining a more exclusive HOA across town, or possibly starting her own private neighborhood in Kansas. No one really knew. But one thing was clear. The reign of Karen Delacroix had come to a fiery, mulch-covered end. The air in Chestnut Ridge had a strange stillness to it in the days that followed the HOA trial. For the first time in what felt like forever, the streets were quiet, the lawns unmonitored, and not a single golf cart rolled by with sirens or laminated warnings. The Karen era, as everyone had started calling it, was officially over. Her house stood somber and shuttered, the blinds perpetually drawn, the front yard devoid of all gnomes except one that someone had zip-tied to the mailbox as a grim little farewell. Its face had been painted with a tear, and someone had taped a note on it that read, "We'll never forget." Unfortunately, Karen had gone silent. No social media posts, no neighborhood flyers, not even a late-night rant on the community bulletin board. It was as if she had folded inward like a collapsing lawn chair. But even in her absence, no one trusted that things were truly done. Ricky, who knew a thing or two about stubbornness from his years in the Navy and 3 marriages, kept saying, "She's the kind that always gets the last word, even if it's written in glitter on a courtroom summons." Still, life slowly returned to a semblance of normal. Colonel Baines and his team wrapped up their simulation with minimal fanfare, quietly packing up their equipment, and leaving a clean, polite note in the HOA mailbox thanking the neighborhood for its unexpected but instructive cooperation. Before they left, Baines handed Ricky a small metal coin, cool and heavy with the engraving of an eagle and the words, "Exemplary civilian contribution." Ricky held it up, admired the weight of it, then tossed it to me with a grin and said, "Not bad for a guy who just came here to dump mulch." He may have been playing it cool, but I saw the way he tucked the accompanying certificate behind the bar in his garage next to a signed baseball and a photo of him and Toby in matching life vests. With the military gone and the HOA under new management, it didn't take long before the neighborhood transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Gone were the days of paranoid patrols and arbitrary fines. Phyllis, now officially elected as HOA president, kept her promises. She replaced Karen's legacy of fear with something simple and radical: snacks and civility. Every Friday, there were donuts and coffee in the clubhouse. Rules were relaxed. Decorations were encouraged. Lawn flamingos staged a triumphant return. The biggest change came when Ricky, grinning like a man who had just won the weirdest war in suburban history, announced his newest project, a total landscape redesign of the Chestnut Ridge Community Center. It was part of a formal agreement Phyllis had negotiated with the DoD, something about community beautification as counterintelligence mitigation. No one really understood it, but it meant Ricky had the green light and a blank canvas. On day one of the project, he pulled up with his truck, a trailer full of sod, and a flatbed carrying the piece de resistance, a boulder. Not just any boulder. This thing was enormous, deliberately shaped, and engraved with the words, "Let it mulch," on one side and an unmistakable hand gesture on the other, one that, if you squinted, looked suspiciously like a stone middle finger pointing directly at Karen's old house. No one said anything. No one had to. The entire street came out to watch it being lowered into place, silently sipping coffee like it was an art installation unveiling. Toby marked it as his territory within 15 seconds. Karen never came outside during the installation. But we all saw the curtains move. A few days later, a moving truck arrived. Just one. Small. Efficient. Quiet. Karen left the way she lived, controlling every detail, yet somehow missing the bigger picture. She didn't wave goodbye. Didn't speak to anyone. Just stood at the edge of her driveway in a beige pantsuit, arms crossed, watching as the last box was loaded. Her golf cart, Justice, had already been sold. According to Ron, who had peeked through his blinds for 3 hours straight, she had traded it in for a Prius and a job offer from some upscale airport HOA in Kansas. "She's their problem now," Ricky muttered, watching her car pull away like a ghost vanishing from a haunted cul-de-sac. The neighborhood exhaled. In the weeks that followed, Chestnut Ridge entered a golden age. Kids played freely again. Sprinklers were left on without fear of fine. Halloween decorations were already going up, and no one cared if they were aesthetic violations. Ricky's business flourished. People who once avoided him were now inviting him for cookouts and asking him for backyard advice. He installed a small patio behind the clubhouse and named it Freedom Garden. Colonel Baines sent a postcard from his next simulation site, which read, "No gnomes here. You're welcome." As for Karen, the legend grew. Her time in the neighborhood was whispered about like a fever dream. New residents were told tales of the great HOA standoff, of the golf cart blockade, and of the trial of the gnomes. Some laughed. Others weren't sure if it was all real. Ricky never confirmed or denied any of it. Instead, he just pointed to the stone boulder with its subtle salute and said, "Everything you need to know is right there." One evening, as the sun dipped below the newly mulched beds of Lot 17, Ricky pulled a couple of folding chairs into the driveway. He cracked open 2 sodas, tossed one to me, and leaned back. Toby lay at our feet, belly up, twitching in a dream where he was probably chasing one of Karen's rogue gnomes into oblivion. "You know," Ricky said, "I've fought wars, hurricanes, and 2 ex-wives with attorneys. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to a determined suburbanite with a fake badge." I laughed, sipping my soda. "You think she's really gone for good?" Ricky scratched his chin. "Maybe. But I've learned one thing: people like that don't vanish. They just find new HOA boards to hijack." We sat in silence for a while, watching the last light fade. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower started. Birds chirped. The neighborhood, for once, was quiet in all the right ways. A week later, an envelope arrived in Ricky's mailbox. No return address. Just his name, typed in blocky bold letters. Inside was a brochure. Glossy. Bright. Titled, Neighborhood Watch Excellence Training, Kansas Division. And inside, a photo of Karen, smiling wide, holding a badge that looked suspiciously familiar. The tagline beneath her photo read, Keeping communities in check, one rule at a time. Ricky closed the brochure and chuckled. Well, he said, tossing it into the fire pit. She's somebody else's mulch problem now. Toby barked once in agreement. And peace, glorious temporary peace, reigned once again in Chestnut Ridge. For now.